The Phala Phala saga has grabbed international media attention. Much of the discussion on international platforms has focused on the investability of the country in the world of international investors. No surprises there. And also what we look at this morning on Media and Society, we look at the legal framework behind the Janusz Waluś judgment. Well, a good morning to you, and thank you so much for joining us on Media and Society. My name is Naledi Moleo, and of course this is the show where we look at the intersection between media and its audiences. So this is a really great platform for you to get in touch with us and talk to us about how you feel about what we as the media feed you. Get onto Twitter, hashtag Media Society, or give us a call on 011 714 0661. Well, we start here this morning, and it's certainly been a story that has grabbed international attention, but definitely the hearts of South Africans. It was the 10th of April in 1993 when the assassination of Chris Hani took place, and this sent the country reeling, with Hani remembered as the representation of the democratic dream. Those who remember the day very vividly will talk about the heartbreak that this caused, mainly amongst black South Africans. Assassin Janusz Waluś was sentenced to death after his arrest in 1993. However, this sentencing was later commuted to life imprisonment after the death penalty was done away with in the country. Well, now fast forward to 2022, where a High Court judgment gave the Department of Correctional Affairs 10 days to release the assassin Janusz Waluś. The Constitutional Court ruled that Justice Minister Ronald Lamola's refusal 2 years ago to grant him parole was irrational and unconstitutional. This has opened up old wounds, and many feel that this ruling by the Constitutional Court was wrong and unjust. I mean, it's been a big discussion in the country. But really, let's ask the true questions. Was that decision constitutional? And have we as the media done enough to really explain what was behind that ruling by the Court? Do we do a good enough job of explaining the legal system of our country as well? Well, we unpacked this discussion this morning with Mr. Ritumetse Benedict Phiri, who is, of course, a legal analyst. Thank you so much for joining us, and good morning to you.
Good morning, Naledi. Thank you.
You get interviewed a lot. You're a very famous face. And you spend a lot of time giving legal analysis on various media platforms. When you look at the coverage that the parole process of Janusz Waluś has undertaken, do you feel that the media has clearly explained to the public what was going on there, and have you been asked the right questions?
I think I can start with the second question. I think from a legal perspective, I've been asked the right questions, because when the question comes, it's really, what did the Constitutional Court have to do, and did it actually arrive at its decision in the right way? With this particular matter, I think the media missed the history of the matter. The fact that Mr. Waluś has been applying for parole multiple number of times, and each time he has been improving his parole application and has put himself in a place where, in fact, the minister had to give him parole because he actually complied with, the requirements to be granted parole. And I think that got missed in the debate in this particular point in time, that this was a problem coming for a long time because the minister hadn't been dealing with it decisively or politically in a way which could shield the Constitutional Court from actually putting a decision in place, which felt like it was a massive decision, but when you look at it legally, it was actually the right thing.
I mean, that's a tough thing to hear. That's the reality, and I wonder if the media perhaps struggled to get that across because this is such an emotive issue in South Africans. But let's actually look at how the media has done in covering the story. Take a look at this.
Posimampuru Correctional Facility. It has been Waluś's home for the past 29 years. Last month, the Constitutional Court ordered the release of Chris Hani's Polish killer on parole, and Chief Justice Raymond Zondo left parole conditions to the Justice Minister to decide. A week after the ruling, Waluś was stabbed by another inmate while queuing for food. His release was delayed while he received medical treatment. Now he's been discharged from hospital and is no longer within the four walls of the prison cell. The department says Walusz will serve 2 years under community corrections in line with the parole regime upon which he is released. The Justice and Correctional Services Department says the decision to deny him parole previously wasn't to avenge Hani's killing, but simply in the interest of justice. It added that there's no question that offender Walusz is a polarizing figure and that his release has understandably reopened wounds among some people in the society, especially the late Hani's family. Mulimawane Muto, SABC News, Pretoria.
Well, there it is. I mean, that's how we've been telling the story here as South African media, particularly here at the SABC. But it's not been an easy one, because if you look at that ruling the day it happened, the trending discussion was the reaction of Chris Hani's widowed wife. And that became a really big emotive issue. Let's talk a little bit about whether or not you felt that the media has been afraid to actually tackle the technicalities of it because of how deeply invested South Africans are in Chris Hani and his assassination.
Yeah, in fact, I was on an SABC show that weekend, and I felt exactly what you're saying, that we got caught up in the emotion of the matter, and Dimpho Hani's reaction led, the conversation that day and days to come. And we forgot what the Constitutional Court had actually done. We forgot the actual conversation that the Justice Minister had put himself into a position where he could actually never grant Janusz Waluś parole, despite the fact that the law did not allow that. The law allows for anybody to apply for parole once they've served the minimum time and have actually met all the requirements for parole. And this is why the Justice Minister's decision not to grant him parole was irrational, because Janus Waluś would never get parole, but that's not the constitutional scheme or the legal scheme of the country. And I think that was actually missed, in the hype and the furore around the emotional stuff. What the court actually did was actually missed.
Yeah, let's bring in another legal analyst now. Alton Romeo Hart joins us via Zoom. Alton, a good morning to you. Thank you so much for giving us your time as well on this Sunday morning. Benedict and I have been talking about really the emotion behind the Janusz Waluś ruling and how the media has fared in actually breaking down the legal process behind this parole being granted. And if you feel that you've been asked the right question as a legal analyst by media practitioners, or have you found that the media has been afraid to address the fact that this parole was in fact constitutional?
No, I won't say the media felt this. Most probably, I won't even hold the media to that higher standard as legal practitioners, that we need to know how the process of parole should and must work. That is something of a legal nature, and obviously it's governed by two pieces of legislation. You would look at the type of sentence that was handed down in terms of the Criminal Procedure Act as well as the Correctional Services Act, and you have to marry these two, and sometimes the media houses don't necessarily know how these two marry and on what grounds parole is granted to persons. So I don't think it's that the media are afraid, but I think that maybe if they asked maybe the right questions as to what factors leads to certain things, and obviously how does life imprisonment actually work, then maybe we would have gotten to the right answers.
Yeah, well, can we get to those answers now? Because I think the day that the parole was granted by the ruling was made by the court, I talked earlier about Dimpho Hani, the widow of Chris Hani, coming out, and that being a very big discussion on the media, on social media platforms as well. But one of the things she says is that Justice Zondo did not mention me and my family. You see, that's a very emotive point, because immediately we think, was the Hani family not consulted, right? And that's a very big part of the process of granting parole, correct?
Yes, no, definitely. So obviously when a parole process is underway, then you will have the victim or the victim's family that was affected by the crime that was committed, as well as the offender. They will have that victim offender interaction, sort of reconciliation that is going. But I also think that this also stems from the TRC, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, where the offender was actually afforded an opportunity to actually say, listen, yeah, who instructed you to actually kill Chris Hani? And he was not open, he did not disclose, and he was sort of, if one can say, he was economical with the information as to who gave him the instruction. And for the Hani family, and also I think for the broader South African population, that seems that this man does not show remorse for his actions. And obviously when they look at parole, they also look at, does the offender show remorse? Does he take responsibility for his actions, that he has committed a very, very serious offense? And then it means that you are on the path, and or your mindset is right, that you look that you can be rehabilitated. Obviously, if you go on parole, it should be something that the parole board must say that this guy is rehabilitatable. That's why we're sending him out on parole back in society to be among the citizens of the country, and he might not re-offend. But if not, then they should keep you in prison. So I think that's where the Hani family is coming from, that story that emanated from the TRC.
Did that happen sufficiently? I mean, that process of saying, well, he has shown remorse, and that the consultations, even with the Hani family, have indeed happened.
Yeah. So I think just to take a step back, you know, what Justice Zondo and the Constitutional Court were required to do was to test the rationality of the minister's decision not to grant parole. So that's actually quite a limited inquiry that the court was venturing into. And in getting to that inquiry, they obviously work out what did the minister have in front of him insofar as the information that led him to this decision. And part of the information that he had was that Janusz Waluś had actually tried to make 2 apologies to the Hani family. And as part of that, there were psychological reports that showed that he actually is actually remorseful, and he's actually a person that can actually be rehabilitated. So, you know, Justice Zondo did take into account the record that the minister had in front of him in that respect. And the minister actually, in fact, also said, you know, these are factors that weigh towards the granting of parole. So from a Justice Zondo perspective, all he needed to satisfy himself was that the minister had, in fact, taken that apology into account in coming to his decision, and he found that he did. But there was a critical factor where the minister actually applied the wrong test to come to the decision that he makes. So from a constitutional court perspective, I think it was sufficient that Justice Zondo said all the bits and pieces were ticked off, and that was done quite meticulously. And obviously the apology was not sufficient for the Hani family the 2 times that it was made.
And for many South Africans.
And for many South Africans.
Well, let's take your calls, 0117140661. And really the question we're asking is, did the media do enough to really inform you around how that decision to grant Janusz Waluś parole, did it do enough? Did you understand the technicalities behind that legal process? 0117140661. We've got Slindile in Kagiso. Slindile, good morning to you. Thanks for calling. Sindile in Kagiso, thanks for calling.
Thank you so much, my sister. I think the media is scared of asking the right questions, especially when something has to do with the ANC, because if you hear the statements of the ANC, they are holding us as a country into ransom and making us feel guilty about something that is it's in the legal fraternity. They should be asking questions especially to the politicians. What happened to other prisoners who are supposed to get parole, and they're not raising those questions? We can talk about the Cock, who was released by the same government. Why don't the media ask how did that come about? Because the Cock has killed so many people and many families. They don't even know where those bodies are still buried today. But it's been supported by the very same government, and he's getting a stipend every month. He's got a house from this government. Why don't you ask those questions as a leader? That if you hold us ransom about Chris Hani, let his soul rest in peace. We understand that this man has done his time. Why don't you ask the same questions about other parolees that have been done illegally or under the carpet by the same government? So that's my question.
Yep.
The media needs to ask those questions for us to see whether there's fairness there. They should not be scared or hold the ANC into that high regard that they're scared to ask those questions because they are emotionally blackmailing us as a country. Thank you.
Yeah. Sindile, thank you so much for calling. We'll take more calls on 011-714-0661. I know we've got another caller on the line, but I want to quickly respond to what Sindile has said. Benedict, have you had, in those interviews that you have done throughout this period, had those comparisons made?
No, actually. And I think what Sindile makes is a very good point, because this was actually a failure of a political process and not the court taking too much position in a political space, because many times the minister could have actually made sure that this parole process is actually dealt with in a way that Janusz Waluś, could stay in the prison system for as long as is necessary. And let's not forget that the Correctional Services Act, which creates the scheme for parole, is enacted by Parliament. And, there are categories of other prisoners who, from struggle era, who are still in prison and are not entitled to parole. And the question is, why are our politicians not creating a parole regime for matters such as these, which can be actually emotional and polarizing?
Yeah, and the thing is, if you don't have the media asking the question, you will have the frustrations from South Africans that are thinking it and wondering why that conversation isn't happening on screen. Ngosnati is on the line in Piet Retief. Ngosnati, good morning to you.
Yes, sorry, ma'am.
Ngosnati?
Yes, ma'am, how are you?
I'm well, sir. Thank you so much for calling. What are your views?
Yes, so just I want to find out, as now they have been given Waluś the parole. Waluś never been told the South Africa the truth, who was sent him to be killed, prison. So that he didn't give the truth before. Maybe they give some pay, say, oh, the guy, he gives the South African the truth, who was sent him to be killed a person. But now it's just to give him parole.
Yeah.
Yes.
Ngosnati, thank you so much for calling. Elton, I'm going to bring you in here because, Ngosnati is essentially saying, did he ever reveal who ordered the hit on Chris Hani? And we're not really having a discussion about the merit of the case necessarily. We're talking about whether or not the media has certainly tried to find those answers from the audiences. I mean, what do you say to that? Have we done enough to ask that particular question? And then what is the answer?
No, I think the media shied away from the question, actually asking that, did Waluś actually tell the broader South Africa who really killed Chris Hani? But then I also think that, is that a fair question for the media to ask? Because it's not their place. That's a place for the TRC back then. And obviously one looks at, when you look at parole, a person will come and maybe at first glance, when he appears for the first time at parole, he's not open, honest. And then the parole board says, listen, it doesn't seem that you've shown remorse. It doesn't show that you comprehend that your actions was wrongful and you don't take ownership, but we'll send you back for further profile. And then later on, you come back for the profile, and now you've attended certain programs, and now you come to them and say, listen, I take ownership of my 1, 2, 3. I've done this. And then they would now call in the victim or the victim's family. And in that meetings, most probably the victim's families can then ask the questions. Now we know that Janusz Waluś made 2 attempts to actually have that sort of victim-offender meeting. Most probably he would have disclosed in that meetings, and maybe South Africa would not have known what or who killed Chris Hani, but maybe his family, his widow, would have known by now that actually who was instrumental in the process of eliminating Chris Hani. So that, for me, I think that the South African population, the broader population, is that we're looking with emotions at this thing and saying that, okay, he has not in public made known who, but that's not how parole works. In parole, the people will go to the parole hearing, the parole board, and they will have that meetings between the victim and the offenders. And that's normally where some of this information will come out, that they will disclose and actually in that apology disclose and say what actually transpired on the day. So that is now one of the things. And obviously, when we look at the type of sentence that Janusz Waluś got, life sentence, because when he was sentenced, he did not disclose, because that could have been a mitigating factor where he would have most probably gotten a different type of sentence if he disclosed back then. But I mean, back then he was not ready to talk about this. I think the 2 times he tried to make he was then. So we, or the South African population or citizens, look at it with emotions, but you must also know the legal processes. You need to be objective and detach it from the emotive processes.
Yeah, I mean, it's a difficult thing. This was a tough one for South Africans. We're going to continue the discussion, though, on the other side of this. So do stay with us. You're still watching Media and Society. We're having a discussion around whether or not the media did a sufficient enough job of explaining the parole process that Janusz Waluś went through for him to be granted that parole. 011-714-0661 is the number to share your thoughts with us as well. We're back in a moment.
Decided to give him parole, which it is a sad moment, especially for a black nation.
He must tell us the honest truth, who sent him.
The family is still suffering even today. I mean, they haven't found the closure to say who killed their father, their husband.
The Constitutional Court has said he must be released, and that's what must happen. He must be released.
And those are the views of South Africans on the streets as they share how they feel about Janusz Waluś being released on parole. But this morning on Media and Society, we're asking if you are satisfied with the media's role throughout that process. And did we answer all of the questions, or at least ask the questions that are being asked there by South Africans? 011-714-0661 is how you give us a call. We've got Tseredi on the line. Tseredi, good morning to you. Thank you so much for calling.
Yes, it's everybody from Ramarishani.
Hey.
I want my people to open their eyes here and look into this issue with very much serious view, because if you look, our justice system itself is tailless and is headless. How many freedom fighters are still behind bars in this country? They were arrested even before Janusz Waluś killed our leader, Chris Hani. Those people are still behind bars. It seems like a black man will always be a victim, whether the regime is black or white. Because if you look at the issue of Eugene de Kock, how many people did Eugene de Kock kill? That man was paroled, and I believe that he was paroled through the backyard. And I was shocked to learn that he was even given money. I don't know what the money was for. Janusz Waluś didn't show any remorse. Janusz Waluś didn't tell us truth. So I want to appeal to the so-called SABC in our country to withdraw from the so-called alliance. It is useless. Chris Hani was not an ANC favorite. We must face the fact here. People must come together and face the government. I want to say publicly that Janusz Waluś did not want to tell us who instructed him to kill Chris Hani, because those are big names. We all know. We can't mention names, but we've got brains. God gave us brains. We must not disappoint our God. As if we cannot think. Our justice system must be changed. The so-called constitution must be changed, must be amended for the benefit of the citizens of South Africa. That's all I can say.
No.
Thank you.
Tseredi, that was fire. Thank you so much for calling in, Tseredi in Limpopo. Again, really demonstrating just how close this issue is to the hearts of many South Africans. And during the break there, Benedict Piri made a very important point about the fact that, well, I mean, you're right here in the studio with us. You can see how fast things move in a news environment. And a lot of the time when a story breaks, I'm going to call you immediately and say, Janusz Waluś is being released on parole. I need you to get on air and comment. And the reality is, we all haven't necessarily had the time to go through that judgment. We need to break a story, right?
Yeah, and I think that's part of, what creates the question. Is the media reporting accurately? Because initially when the story breaks, there's a lead, an angle, but maybe all of the facts have not been distilled, and actually the process, as we're discussing now, has not been explained properly. And I think what tends to happen is that the story breaks and builds its own head of steam, and then a couple of days later, someone else is like, hang on a second, we actually haven't looked at it from this perspective.
Right.
And that sets up a new debate. And I think as long as the media creates that, I think we can always get to a space where all the issues are adequately ventilated.
Yeah.
But initially, I think one or two issues lead to the detriment of others, which are just as important in the reporting process as well.
That's essentially dissecting the legal elements of it. Romy, Elton, I'm going to bring you in here as well, because you also continuously give legal analysis. Do we give you enough time to actually go through a judgment, or is it just, the story's broken, Elton, let's get on here?
No, obviously, sometimes it happens, and I know for the media houses, it's about business, it's about ratings and stuff like that. So when the story breaks, they want to break it first. And sometimes we don't always have all the angles, all the facts before us, and we need to sometimes give input on the matter. And maybe that's also sometimes things that contribute to maybe say that maybe one can get a skewed view of really how a process unfolds. But that's now the nature of the beast, and we have to deal with it. But obviously, as legal practitioners, and I think Benedict will agree with me, we should make sure that we acquaint ourselves with the facts. And if we know that we only have like sort of a skewed view of something, then we should refrain from actually making a assertion or a allegation based on that limited information. Then most probably then speak on hypotheticals to say, listen, if this happened, this can happen. If that happened, this can happen. And then you need to give all the options with the limited information that can possibly happen in a specific scenario. And that's how you need to work with these things. So if you know you've got limited information, then you can't say, definitely this is what happened, and they did not take into consideration 1, 2, 3. Rather say, if this happened, this is a possibility. That is, you give all the options that's on the table for the taking.
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly a difficult position that the media puts legal analysts in, and I'm happy to appreciate that as well. But we're taking your call, 011-714-0661. The question we're asking is, are you satisfied with how the media did in bringing you the story of the parole of Janusz Waluś? And I know that it's going to be difficult for us to also engage in the discussion without a lot of us sharing our emotions about the parole as well. So those are welcome. 011-714-0661. That's the number to call. Mbuisa's on the line in Pietermaritzburg. Mbuisa, good morning to you, brother.
Good morning, my sister. Yes, to be honest, the manner in which this issue of Janusz Waluś was publicized to the community, I think it not reflected the true sense of what is happening. I'll tell you that the only side we saw the Chris Hani family angry, public angry, and that was vented to the Chief Justice, who simply applied the rules of law. But all I wish to say is that the parole system of South Africa, it is highly, highly, highly unfair, because it seems as if it takes a fight. It is easy for a white person to get a parole, and then that is not actually I'm saying this because you'll remember the case of Mr. Mufamai, who is now an MP. It was difficult for him to get the parole. There is Janusz Waluś, who have done something unthinkable. When Clive David Lewis died after getting a parole, his wife actually was asked that he might tell the truth. He died without telling the truth. The Clive David Lewis just said that what truth? She just simply asked the question, what truth do you want? It means that they know that they didn't tell the truth. So I'm saying the parole system of South Africa must change, and then we must be taught by the media as to how is these things are being done. Because the only thing that we see here, white people are getting a leeway. I'm saying this because you remember the case of that voice guy, I think it's Barry Freedom. He killed black people. He was just a criminal. But now, McBride was made a scapegoat to say that we can't sentence this one to death if you don't sentence McBride to death. I don't know if you know that story. All I'm saying is that why people will always get preference in everything in South Africa until something right is done. Thank you very much.
Yeah, Mbuisa, thank you so much for calling. You know, I'm hearing the points that you're making, and I'm wondering, as a media practitioner, as a news anchor myself, what that says about me, if I'm interviewing a legal analyst and I say, is there a racial disparity in how we dole out parole in this country? I mean, and I'm not talking about whether or not he's correct. I'm saying, is it unethical of me as a journalist to even ask that question, because we should be operating from a place that says all are equal under the law, correct?
Yeah, I think, you know, there is a question as well as to what informs that question from a factual perspective, because it's not easy to speak to that unless you're actually watching the statistics and the applications and how they actually go through. But I just want to put on what Romeo actually said earlier, and he said, well, as part of the parole application for Walusz, he would have actually said to one or two people in that system, I'm remorseful, I take accountability for what I did, and this is actually what I did. And I think the question that the media isn't asking, because you can hear the commentary saying, we don't know, what did this guy do, who gave him the instructions, how did it happen? But there is somebody in that parole system who actually knows the answer, because it contributed to him getting parole and him being seen as remorseful and as being ready to be rehabilitated. So the question that the media is not asking is, who was the story told to? And why is that person sitting with this story when all of us actually need to hear it? I think that's an important question that the media is missing in this part of the story here.
Yeah. I mean, it's quite a few gaps that we seem to have left open. Grido's on the line in Cape Town. Grido, good morning to you.
Morning, Lydia. In my opinion, justice has to be impartial and more so unemotional. We cannot judge on emotions, and this was a highly emotional case. I still get goosebumps when I think of it. I was at the parade at the time when the big demonstrations happened. And what we need to see now is there is a person, doesn't matter the sex, the gender, did this person serve its time? Did it do everything, all the parole requirements? And if so, we need to release this person. Never mind what happened at the time, in what context at the time. We cannot have justice be ruled by emotions or by political correct standards at the time, my opinion.
Yeah, Guido, thank you so much for calling. Guido there is speaking to us in Cape Town. I want to actually bring the question that we got from Mbuisa to Elton as well, about whether or not it's fair for me, and I'm asking you to assist me here as a media practitioner, Elton. Is it even fair for me to interview you and say to you, is there a racial disparity around how we dole out parole in the country? Or does, you know, am I wrong to ask that question? Because I said earlier, I operate from a place that says all are equal under the law.
Now, lady, I won't say it's wrong of you to ask the question, but am I the right person to answer that question? Because obviously I can give you the legal perspective or the legal background or the legal factors that was taken into consideration in actually granting parole. But the person that will have the information is like looking at the race of the, and Benedict also touched on it to say like, listen, yeah, we need to look at the stats to see how many applications we've received from, say, black persons, from Indian persons, from colored persons, from white persons, to say, listen, yeah, this is what we see, and this is the outcomes on these applications. Then that person, but I will not be, as a legal analyst, be able to give you that answer straight up to say, listen, yeah, unless the stats before me. But one needs to also know that law sometimes also about a money game. So you will have a person that will send this application in and his parole is not granted. And then because it's an administrative decision, he can take it on review. And some people that's not financially strong will not have the opportunity to take that decision on review. And some people will have the money to take it on review. And most probably that's where the difference lie when it comes to the legal processes, to say that sometimes you can also see that people who's more wealthier will take the process until the constitutional court, where a person that has been sentenced or gets something in the regional court, it just ends there and he leaves the sentence like that. So that's now how the system is built. We cannot cover for all eventualities.
Yeah.
And that's now one of the things.
I'm going to squeeze in one last caller because a lot of South Africans really wanting to comment on this one. I think it's Tandi on the line. Tandi, good morning to you.
Morning,
Tembi.
morning. It's not Tandi, it's Tembi.
Oh, thank you, Sis Tembi. Thanks for calling in. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, actually my comment is that if ever the South African government have declared the constitution that a person, if ever was being sentenced, Janus was not sentenced life sentence, was sentenced the years. And so if ever it comes that he must get a parole, he's supposed to get a parole because that was constitutional. He's supposed to get the parole. And then it doesn't need even a discussion, because if ever we can go back to other people who have been killed, like Bantu, Steve
Bantu Biko.
Steve Biko. And even now, we don't even know who was killing Steve Biko. But because of the reconciliation, we can't go backwards, because now what is happening here in South Africa, we're still having an apartheid, but 1991 was talking about reconciliation. The reconciliation is like this, like Janus, when you're supposed to get a parole. So he's supposed to get that parole because he saved his sentence to jail. This is constitutional, that is supposed to get a parole. It doesn't need even a discussion, because it's a time that he must go out because it's saved sentence.
Yeah, Sister Tembi, thanks for calling. Again, it's lots of emotion behind this story, and it's a difficult one to tell, even for the media particularly. Let's hear from Lesiba in Limpopo. Lesiba, good morning to you.
Good morning, how are you?
I'm well, and thank you so much for calling.
I just want to partake in your topic.
Yes, please.
I'm wondering, on this topic, you are talking about the role of the media.
Yes, sir.
Yes, but I want to put it this way. Where it started, it's where it should have been talked about. The correctional service parole process, when it started, that's where nobody knew there is this process that is going on in the background. Then we heard about this only now when this man went to the Constitutional Court to challenge the parole process. But now the Minister of Correctional Services is talking about the review, or the SABC is talking about the constitutional review. They are not talking about the elephant in the room. The problem is the parole process. When in the parole process, I would imagine the Hani family would have been called to say, this man is asking for parole, and then they would have discussed whatever they wanted to discuss. Now, they come as if they are amazed or astonished by what is happening in the Constitutional Court. But I would think they knew what would happen in the Constitutional Court, because the Constitutional Court is looking at the law, not who. Because in prison, there are a lot of political prisoners who we never talk about them. But now we're talking about this man, whereas the parole process started, the Hani family was there, everyone was there, the SABC was there, me and you, we were there. But we never spoke about it. Now we're saying this is the problem.
Yeah, thank you so much for calling in, Lesiba. I just as we wrap up this discussion, because we are, of course, keeping our guests to move on to our next discussion. But I think lessons learned for you, particularly, I think, your call to action to the media coming out of this big story.
I'd like to tack on what Lesiba says.
Yeah.
I think he is right. I think the conversation started a lot earlier and wasn't discussed a lot earlier, because had the minister actually took us into confidence and said, Janus Waluś's parole process has begun, but these are the things that are outstanding, and these are the things I'm considering, given that it is a high-profile matter, and that the media could play and report in that matter, I think we wouldn't be as surprised as we are today. So I think there is a question around how close the media is to these processes in their development, rather than when we get the shock at the end and we're trying to unscramble everything and make it all digestible and understandable.
Yeah, Elton, I think that's a clear call to action for us there is start the early, quicker, start the information earlier. Elton, your call to action for the media where this issue particularly is concerned.
Now, obviously, it's, I think, and I don't want to tell the media now to sharpen up a little bit on legal skills, but also sometimes what we talk about, what is the real legal question? When an issue arises up, what's the real legal questions, the real legal issues? And sometimes maybe I would just say the guy should most probably just take some time, or if you don't know, speak offline with a legal analyst to say, listen, yeah, what is the questions that may arise from the situation that we need to actually ask and try and cover and uncover? And also, who do we need to get the information from? Then I think you're already on a good path to actually get the information. But I know sometimes a story breaks and your producer just tells you something and you need to make something out of it, and very fast. And then you don't necessarily have that time. But if they can, try and speak to a legal analyst offline first and say, listen, yeah, this is the issue. How do we tackle it? What questions? What's the angles that one needs to cover, so that we give a balanced and a fair view to the broader South Africa?
Yeah. Well-read journalists do better. I think that's the key message there. We take a short break, though, when we wrap up this discussion. When we come back, though, we're keeping our two guests and we get into another big story that has captured not just our attention here in the country, but the global community as well, and that is the Phala Phala saga. Stay with us. Welcome back. Well, the Phala Phala saga has grabbed international media attention. Much of the discussion on international platforms, of course, has focused on the investability of the country in the world of international investors. No surprises there. We're going to get into whether or not the media has done a good job of covering that particular story. Before that, though, let's take a look at this.
It's unlikely that President Ramaphosa will certainly vacate his office or be forced out at this particular stage. But if he was to, I think that there would continue to be a reasonable amount of continuity in terms of economic policy, although economic policy essentially in South Africa is already relatively confused. It is a mix, a compromise between the various factions, ideological blocks within the ANC already. And I think that mix or compromise is likely to continue without Ramaphosa at the helm. The big issue from an economic policy point of view, I suppose, is an issue around the independence of the South African Reserve Bank. Certainly Ramaphosa's detractors have been calling for the Reserve Bank to be effectively nationalized. And this would perhaps put added political pressure on the Reserve Bank in future on issues such as interest rate hikes. So I think that would be perhaps the biggest consequence of the removal of Ramaphosa and the weakening of the Ramaphosa faction.
Daniel Silk, political economist, sharing his view there. So there's clear investment in the minute dynamics of this story internationally. But here's the real question for South Africans living with its consequences daily. Do South Africans understand the legal processes that come with this saga, or are they stuck on the politics of it only? Does the president really have a case to answer for, according to the African Transformational Movement? Does the president have a strong case in the Constitutional Court? And on what grounds? On what grounds does the Section 89 report prove in any way, shape or form that the president should step down? That's essentially what happened. The report came out and the calls were the president should step down. But can that decision be made coming out of that particular report? And are we doing enough as the media to really break down some of the minutiae of that discussion? Are you satisfied with our explanations of what is what and how it impacts you? Well, we ask these questions as we continue our discussion with Ridumeze Benedict Piri as well as Elton Romeo Hart, both of them legal analysts. This is a big one. because there are so many processes that are going on. Now, I know you've given commentary on this one as well. Have you been able to, in those discussions with the media, really break down all the different processes and what they actually mean?
I would say yes. I think the problem here is that the parallel processes that have been happening to Section 89 have pretty much gone into the dock. So we don't know where the public protector is with her process. We don't know where the South African Reserve Bank is with its process. We don't know where the Hawks are with their process. And you can't actually say and gauge what the outcome of those processes will be. But the Section 89 process has been public and has to be public. It's a parliamentary process. But I also think what is interesting is because it's the first time, we are one step further than Jacob Zuma now, and it's the first time we're actually having a process like this unfold. So that comes with understanding in and of its own as the process actually unfolds.
Yeah, I think a big question that I certainly have asked legal analysts has been, does the president have a case to answer for? Does he, I suppose the argument is, does he have a position to hold at the Constitutional Court when he's going to hold that report on review? I'm sure you've been asked that question. What is the answer, Elton?
Now, obviously, when one looks at this thing, one needs to distinguish between the parliamentary processes and the legal process. The president has got a constitutional right to take the independent panel's report on review. And I've looked at the application. He sets out fairly substantive grounds for why he's of the view that the panel, not that the panel is incompetent, he just says the panel overlooks certain things that they should have taken into consideration in concluding if he has violated the Constitution or not. So there, I think, as I call it at this point in time, it looks in favor of the president as 70-30 for me. That's my personal view, that he will get the relief seek from the Constitutional Court. 70% in favor of him, 30% he won't get it. The parliamentary process is something totally different. But there is also certain things set out in the Constitution that this motion will be debated and then they have to vote, and they have to vote with a 2/3 majority that they accept that motion that the president has violated the Constitution. And that's not dependent on the legal process. But however, I see the ATM and the other opposition parties who's behind this report now, currently, they want to use the findings of the independent panel to say, listen here, the president has violated the Constitution and hence he should be impeached. And they try and actually sort of submerge the legal aspects into the parliamentary process to try and give it some substance in Parliament. And I think that's where actually the water gets muddied, and then you don't necessarily can then divorce these two completely, because it's now already married to such an extent that it looks like it's the same process. But there's different processes, and Benedict touched on it. The Reserve Bank has its processes. The National Prosecuting Authority has their processes, the Hawk, and those types of things, that the legal aspects where we say there's criminal offenses, it should still be private, confidential until the investigations is completed. Thereafter, the docket will then be made available to the person accused of committing or alleged to have been committed a certain crime.
Yeah, I know. And you see, the thing about discussions like these, and much like the one we had earlier with Waluś, is that it's almost difficult to have the discussion around media's role without touching on the actual issue. And that's why I wanted to do that. But considering all the different touch points that you've talked about there, Elton, you've talked about the process of the Reserve Bank, the parliamentary process, the constitutional process. There's so much. Is the media touching all of those points in the legal analysis that you've given us? I mean, are we asking the questions that even go all the way to the process that the Reserve Bank should be undertaking?
If I just have to give you a short answer, I don't think they touch on everything, because sometimes, and again, it will go down to the knowledge of the legal fields or the legislation that covers that specific point. But I could also see that some of the media houses, and I've listened to some of the radio shows, is also that they try and treat this as one process where they actually need to dissect and say, listen here, this thing has different compartments, and make known to South Africa, this compartment, this is where the Reserve Bank regulations has been violated, and there he can be criminally charged. But they haven't touched so in depth in those compartments. They try and say, we just dump one thing in one bucket and we want to make it as juicy as possible because sensation sells something, and they bring it through. And I think that's when you get the South African people also jumping on the bandwagon, but not necessarily understanding the legal processes.
Yeah, do you agree?
I think there is an important question which has shifted given the outcome of the panel and what has the president has brought his review. I think the question really now in the spotlight are these rules that were made by Parliament to hold a president impeachable. I think people don't actually appreciate that a lot of the confusion comes in the fact that the rules say that MPs must bring information to the panel, but then the panel must satisfy itself that there's sufficient evidence. So there's a mismatch between the word information and the word sufficient evidence, and the type of information and the manner it's brought to the panel. And that's something that's created by the rules of Parliament. So it's actually a problem that people should actually be grappling with. I think that's a very important question. Fortunately, the Constitutional Court will weigh in here, but it is an important discussion to have because that's what the President's review has brought to the fore.
Yeah, I'm noting it all down. I'm noting it all down. And as we get into the new week, we'll make sure that we touch all those points and that we do a good enough job here as the media. Thank you so much for watching Media and Society. Thank you as well to my guest, legal analyst Alton Romeo Hart, as well as Ritumetse Benedict Piri. We really look forward to spending some time with you again next week, Sunday, right here on Media and Society. Have yourselves a fabulous day.